The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring are two of my favorite games ever made. But which one of them is better? Well, that's what I hope to find out in this video, because today I have 5 categories that will hopefully prove which one is better once and for all. Alright, the first thing we're going to be talking about is the open world of both games. Now, Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring are both in the open world genre, so naturally, it's a pretty big aspect of the experience. Now, let me just say, these games both do a fantastic job of making an immersive open world. However, they're both presented in pretty different ways. Hyrule is a shadow of its former glory, but its exploration still has a relatively lighthearted tone despite the monsters you encounter on your journey. In stark contrast, Lands Between is pretty much a barren wasteland with the exception of some places. But despite their stylistic differences, the worlds actually have a pretty similar premise. They both start with you, the player, being chucked into a post-apocalyptic world with little knowledge of your surroundings. You slowly build up your character's capability and take on many trials and tribulations along the way. Now, Elden Ring does take a good amount of inspiration from Breath of the Wild, but I overall think it delivers a better open world. It definitely refined what BOTW set up. I'll get more into this in a later category, but I think it overall provides a better and more refined exploration experience. Hyrule in Breath of the Wild does have a good amount of variation in the terrain, but a lot of it is just forest, hilly type landscapes. The biomes that stray from this archetype are Akala, Zora's Domain, Death Mountain, Faerun, and Gerudo Desert. Now you might be thinking, well, that's a lot of regions. In fact, that's over half of the biomes in all of Breath of the Wild. And you'd be correct. However, most of these regions have gimmicks that wear off with time. For example, Alcala seems really good at first. You see it and you're like, wow, this region's so amazing, and it's beautiful, which it is. But that's kind of the problem. Its draw lies only in its visual appeal and not in the gameplay of the biome. And Gerudo Desert, well, it's kind of in the name. Aside from a few bosses and story quests, it's pretty empty. It's not that I don't enjoy exploring these places. In fact, I love exploring them, especially on my first playthrough. It's just, in my opinion, Elden Ring brings much more content to the table. Everyone remembers the moment in Elden Ring where you stare upon Liurnia for the first time, glancing over the vast overlook. Or the moment when you finally get to the capital, Leyndell. And I think these wow moments really contribute to Elden Ring's world immersion. So this was a highly contested category because these games both have amazing worlds, but overall I think I'm going to give the point to Elden Ring. The next category of both games is the story. Now this is a weird one because contrary to the open world, neither of these games really put much of an emphasis on the narrative. Sure, they both have pretty deep running lore, but these games substitute the usual story missions for exploration and stumbling upon things in the open world. Now in a lot of ways I prefer this archetype of game design because it allows for more player freedom. But that's besides the point. So the main premise of Breath of the Wild story is that you have to free Hyrule, the kingdom, from the main protagonist of the game, Ganon. This objective is basically just a setup for you to build up your power in Hyrule until you eventually gain enough power to liberate Hyrule and free Princess Zelda. Now despite their differences, Elden Ring is kind of similar in premise. In the beginning you fight a boss that you inevitably lose to, this is a From Software game, and you fall down to the Lands Between. Your goal is to liberate the Lands Between by killing a bunch of bosses called shard bearers and minor bosses along the way while getting help from the Round Table Hold. Now obviously the story is much more complicated than that. I don't even understand it entirely, but this is the basic premise that's laid out in the game itself without having to explore the lore. Now these games both treat story as a pretty minor element, but I overall think The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild emphasizes it more in comparison to Elden Ring. Throughout the game, you don't just beat monsters and get more powerful, you also uncover Link's past. As you free the Divine Beasts and unlock Link's memories, you get an outlook on what happened in this world, and Elden Ring really doesn't have that much stuff like it. The only palpable story moments in Elden Ring are the intros to the boss fights. Now, these are really cool, especially Godric's one, but they don't really hold a candle to the story moments in Breath of the Wild. I think Breath of the Wild places a far more important emphasis on the story in contrast to Elden Ring. I think Elden Ring's story moments are delivered more through the open world, like seeing the capital of Leyndell, Liurnia, etc. But I think Elden Ring is an overall less story-focused game, which is why I'm going to have to give the point to Breath of the Wild. Alright, so the next category is exploration. Now this is definitely similar to the open world, but there are a few differences. This category is about the act of discovering the world rather than the world itself. Now, to be honest, both these games take a pretty similar approach when it comes to exploration. They both start you off in a condensed area, Limgrave and the Great Plateau, and they both make you think the worlds are much smaller than they actually are. And in my opinion, this is a good thing because it allows you to stay immersed in the worlds by discovering them over time. In Breath of the Wild, this means gliding off the Great Plateau after doing the 4 base shrines, which are essentially a tutorial. And in Elden Ring, similarly, this means beating Margit and getting to Liurnia, which is, albeit a much longer, tutorial. Now, Elden Ring does give you a lot more freedom from the get-go, but they still take a relatively similar approach overall. These games both provide some of the best exploration experiences in the gaming medium, and it was really hard to make up my mind of which one was better. But I think I'm going to give the slight edge to Elden Ring. This may sound redundant, but it does have the advantage of being a more recent game and therefore more refined. Also, like I said earlier, it gives you more freedom from the get-go, which is always a good thing. Also, the variation I talked about earlier in the open world helps with exploration not getting old as fast. So overall, these games both have some of the best exploration in the medium of gaming overall, but I'm going to have to give the point to Elden Ring. Now, the next thing I'm going to be talking about is something far more nuanced than the story or open world, and that is innovation. This is probably the category I'm going to spend the least amount of time on, but I think it's important to commemorate games for revolutionary ideas, because I've been constantly saying that Elden Ring defined what Breath of the Wild set up, and this is true. But it's important to recognize BOTW pioneered these ideas. It was one of the first games to include that level of player freedom, and it really hadn't been seen before. The only games really comparable to it was Skyrim and maybe The Witcher 3. Now, Skyrim did have a lot of player freedom, but the progression was really not based around the open world, unlike Breath of the Wild. And The Witcher had a good amount of exploration, but it's honestly more of a narrative RPG than anything else. Breath of the Wild was truly the first game to develop the open world as a foreground rather than a background, and I have to commemorate it for this. Now, Elden Ring was From Software's first foray into the open world genre, but honestly, it really wouldn't have been as good without Breath of the Wild's influence. So I'm going to give the innovation point to Breath of the Wild. Alright, so the final category is combat. Now, I actually really enjoyed the combat mechanics in both of these games. Breath of the Wild's combat is simplistic, but satisfying, and Elden Ring's combat is, well, kind of the classic From Software experience, which is obviously amazing. Now, in my opinion, this is much more clear-cut than the exploration or the open world, because Souls games are known for their fantastic but punishing combat, while Zelda kind of has it as an afterthought. Elden Ring stuck to the formula that From Software games have been having for a while now, but it just added the jump button and some other bells and whistles, which I'm not really complaining about that. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think one of the best parts about this game's combat is the variety in the weapons and builds. From katanas to magic staffs to spinning wheels, this game has unrivaled variety in its arsenal. And I think the developers at From Software, maybe unintentionally, made the game more accessible as a result of that. Now, I played this as my first Souls game, and make no mistake, I was getting absolutely destroyed in the beginning hours of my experience. In fact, I think it took me like 3 hours of tries just to beat the Bloodhound Knight, like one of the first bosses you come across in the open world. But I think in a lot of ways, this game can be as hard or as easy as you like. You could choose to use or avoid mage builds, summoning, and whatever, so I think it's pretty balanced for both new players and veterans of the Souls franchise. Now, with all that being said, Breath of the Wild does have a pretty robust combat system. The flurry rushes and parries are always satisfying to pull off, and that weapon variety is strong just like in Elden Ring. Many people complain about the durability system, but in a lot of ways, I didn't mind it that much. For me at least, the second a weapon broke, I would find a better one just around the corner, especially in the early to mid game. The only real issue I had with it is that it made you hoard your weapons and never use them like the average TLC hoarder, but overall these games both have robust and solid combat systems. However, I think most people would agree that Elden Ring delivers an overall more fun and exhilarating fighting experience, which is why I'm going to give it the combat point. Alright, so the results are in, and congratulations on Elden Ring for winning the video. Now, Elden Ring may have won, and I think it's my preferred game overall, but like I said in the intro, these games are both some of my favorites ever made, and it's kind of a close race. But with that being said, which one do you prefer, Elden Ring or Breath of the Wild? Let me know in the comments below. Alright, so I think that's going to be about it for the video. If you're still here, thank you so much for sticking around till the end. I really appreciate it, and yeah, that's about it. See you guys in the next one. And if you enjoyed this video, check out this one where I listed my top 10 favorite games of all time.